Hello and welcome back to Bookish. This is the third time I've tried to shoot this video, which is ostensibly a review of The Unvanquished by William Faulkner. This was a buddy read I did with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classes, or BH Books and Classics, I believe is what his channel's named now. I'll leave a link to his first video about this book down below. I think he's planning on doing some more, so hopefully you'll keep following his videos. I think this is going to be my only one. This is actually a reread for me. 15 to 20 years ago, I pretty much read all the Faulkner novels that are set in the fictional county of Yoknapatawpha, Mississippi, and I read The Unvanquished at that time too. But this time it felt different, and I think it has something to do with things going on in the country today, and my kind of evolving ideas of what it means to be a Southerner. So, book first. The Unvanquished is set during the Civil War and the Reconstruction period in the South. This book follows the story of Bayard Sartoris from about the age of 12 to about the time he's, I think, a sophomore or a junior in college. Bayard Sartoris lives on a plantation or a large farm that belongs to his father, Colonel Sartoris. Bayard's mother died shortly after he was born. Bayard's best friend is Ringo, an African-American, an enslaved African-American young man who is treated very differently than the other slaves on the plantation. Ringo lives in the house and spends his days with Bayard, even at the age of 12, and is raised like a member of the family. To me, this suggests that Ringo is actually the child of Colonel Sartoris and one of his female slaves. Bayard and Ringo are being raised by Bayard's grandmother, who's just referred to as Granny. While Colonel Sartoris is off fighting the Civil War. The action in the novel begins just after Grant's capture of Vicksburg, and it carries us through Union soldiers coming through northern Mississippi and the chaos they inflict on the Sartoris farm in Colonel Sartoris' absence, the trouble they give to Granny and Bayard and Ringo, and their kind of adventures in the late Civil War period make up the first parts of the novel. In addition to Granny and Bayard and Ringo, I think one of the other primary characters in the book is Bayard's cousin, Drusilla. She was engaged. Her fiancé went off to fight in the Civil War, and he died. That death has really had a powerful emotional impact on her. She cut her hair short, and she is essentially behaving much more like a boy than a girl. Eventually, she runs off and joins Colonel Sartoris' kind of cavalry troop and actually fights in the Civil War. Colonel Sartoris himself is largely absent from the action of the novel. A lot of the novel takes place with him away from home and kind of as a figure who changes in the eyes of Bayard over the course of the novel. The novel contains all kinds of scenes that will be familiar to anyone who's familiar with the history of Reconstruction and the Civil War. The looting of the Sartoris farm by Union soldiers, Colonel Sartoris coming home, and then participating in activities to destabilize the Republican Reconstruction governments, his efforts to prevent African American men from being able to vote, and then the coming of business and business opportunities to Mississippi are all portrayed in the novel. In addition to that, the novel also does a good job of depicting the life of people in the South, of both races, both African Americans and white Southerners, during the Civil War and immediately afterwards. We see enslaved people in all stages and in all ways in which enslaved people were affected by slavery. Some of the Sartoris slaves are eager to escape and run to meet with Grant's army as it marches through northern Mississippi so that they can become free. Some of the Sartoris' enslaved people stay on the farm and help Granny and help Bayard and Ringo because they're tied to the place through family ties or just through tradition. Ringo himself, very different depiction of an African American character that's probably wholly possible in 1863. He is free to do as he sees fit. He's not forced to labor alongside other slaves. He and Bayard Sartoris are inseparable and do everything together, and he is considered a part of the family. When Granny has to protect Bayard, she also protects Ringo. She speaks in the same. Ringo lives in the same house as they do, and I think he's supposed to represent in the novel this idea that Southerners are going to have to come to grips with accepting equality of African Americans. And I also think at the same time he represents that kind of tragic situation in which African American women were raped by white men in the South and sometimes bore their children. During the Reconstruction period, Unvanquished contains scenes in which we see Colonel Sartoris active as a part of a mob trying to prevent Reconstruction from working and trying to limit the rights of African Americans. Colonel Sartoris' solution to almost all problems is some kind of violence. And indeed, Colonel Sartoris is going to steal the ballot box to make sure African American men aren't allowed to vote, and he kills 2 Republican election officials on Election Day. Later on, with the Civil War over, Colonel Sartoris turns to business and he gets involved in bringing the railroads to northern Mississippi. But he has a business partner. He and that business partner have a falling out, and eventually that business partner kills Colonel Sartoris near the end of the novel. In the last section of the novel, Bayard, who's been off at college reading law, mostly because that's what his father wanted to do, comes back after his father's death and is expected to avenge that death. And I really think the theme of Unvanquished is actually this theme of change in the South, that racial attitudes are going to have to change. The more the characters in the South resist change, the more tragic their ends become. Colonel Sartoris is killed, in part, I think, because he resists change. Colonel Sartoris dies violently, in part because he embraced what really was, in some ways, a Southern tradition of solving problems through violence, which had existed before and during the Civil War. Colonel Sartoris is more or less forced to marry Bayard's cousin Drusilla because her mother is scandalized by the fact that Drusilla has spent all this time in Colonel Sartoris, a widower's company, without any kind of chaperone, and she forces Drusilla to marry the colonel against her will and really against his will, to try to keep up with those old ideas, those old traditional Southern ideas about proper behavior and decorum and behaving ladylike. And that marriage and the fact that she's actually in love with Bayard and not Colonel Sartoris drives her essentially insane after Colonel Sartoris is killed. All the more Faulkner's characters resist change, the more damage they do to themselves and to those around them. And I think that's kind of the powerful message or sub-message of the Unvanquished. And the character of Bayard represents, I think, what being an unvanquished Southerner means, and that means dealing with change and coping with the world in which you find yourself in new ways and seeking new solutions. In the end, Bayard comes home after his father's been killed, and the expectation from his community is that, and his father's former soldiers, and Drusilla and most of the members of his family, is that he will go and kill the man who killed his father. Instead, Bayard goes to that confrontation. He goes to the confrontation as he's expected, but he goes essentially unarmed, and he does nothing while his father's killer fires 2 shots at him, and then his father's killer leaves, never to return. So, as a Southerner, and you should know, I grew up in East Texas, in a small town in East Texas, which is only about 60 miles away from Louisiana. And where I grew up is much more like the South than the Southwest. Because of where I grew up and because of my background, the Unvanquished really resonated with me in lots of different ways. My family traditions are all Southern, and I have called myself a Southerner my entire life, sometimes with pride and sometimes with shame. And one of the things I think that this reason why the Unvanquished had such a powerful effect on me is what's going on in the United States of America right now with what I think we have to recognize is a resurgence of open racism in American society again. And sometimes this is racism cloaked as Southern heritage. And so I wanted to kind of address that as well and kind of, I think, explain, not justify, but explain why the South is still so different today. And it's a really simple answer. The South is still so different today on issues of race and tradition and culturally speaking, and so much more likely to be culturally, socially conservative today because the South didn't even really begin to change until the 1960s. You know, in theory, the Civil War was supposed to change the South by ending slavery, and the events of Reconstruction were supposed to make African Americans equal citizens in the United States. But the truth of the matter is, Southern states just replaced slavery with segregation, and they replaced the plantation economy with sharecropping, and that essentially Southerners found a way to recreate a situation similar enough to slavery that Southern culture and society didn't have to change, that Southern ideas about race didn't have to change, that Southern traditions didn't have to change, and Southerners could go on living much as they'd been living for more than 100 years. And that's truly unfortunate. It's not until the Civil Rights Act of the 1950s and 60s that we begin to see cracks in that kind of solid, regressive Southern culture. I was born in 1967. I grew up in East Texas in the 1970s. My grandfathers were both racist. My parents, who began college in 1960, fortunately kind of broke that cycle of racism, and I was lucky enough to be brought up in a home where racial tolerance was the rule and racial equality was our belief, and I hope that I've lived my life promoting those ideas and exemplifying those ideas as best as I possibly can. Today, we see so many Southerners reacting, in my opinion, stupidly when it comes to the issue of Confederate monuments or flags or whatever it is. And we frequently hear Southerners, talking about heritage and not hate when they're talking about the Confederacy and Confederate monuments, but that's just complete BS. The heritage of the South, as it involves the Confederacy, is a heritage of hate. The Confederacy and the South and the Southern economy and Southern society were built on slavery. The continuance of slavery and the repression of and keeping African Americans enslaved for a long period of time became a part of the Southern way of life. I oftentimes hear people, and it infuriates me as a history teacher, people try to tell me the Civil War wasn't about slavery, that the average Southerner didn't fight to protect the institution of slavery. This is just ridiculous at all levels. People point out only 25% of Southerners owned slaves. Fair enough. That doesn't mean the other 75% didn't see the benefit of continuing slavery. They most certainly did. Slavery had economic benefits for non-slave owners. Non-slave owners, because of the cotton economy in the South, could grow cotton on their own farms and sell it for a profit because there was so much cotton being grown that it drove up demand. Non-slave owning Southerners could rent slaves from slave owners to help them with their farm work and to bring in a larger cash crop so they could profit from it. So you could profit from the use of human labor without owning slaves. You need to also understand that Southerners at a time period were racist. They did not believe in racial equality. They feared a free African American population in the South, and they saw slavery as a way of preserving their racial dominance and preserving their control over African Americans. What's ridiculous is to say that the average, farming Southerner was a devotee of the concept of states' rights. I promise you, slavery had a much more direct impact and was a much more real force in the lives of all Southerners, whether they owned slaves or not, than any kind of, BS about states' rights. So, sorry to go on a mini history rant there, but it's kind of to my point. When I was in school, even though the schools I went to, the elementary schools I went to, and eventually the high school I went to were integrated, hearing the N-word was not uncommon. We had a club at my high school when I was a sophomore in high school where they wore the Confederate battle flag, which, by the way, is not the flag of the Confederacy, which they wore the Confederate battle flag on their T-shirts. And I heard the N-word spoken on a daily basis, and I was confronted by the racism my friends and peers and teachers. The town I grew up in still was largely racially segregated by neighborhood. There was a distinct African American neighborhood in my town, and there were still schools in my town that were in those neighborhoods that were predominantly African American. So when I was in elementary school in the 1970s and I was in high school in the 1980s, it was only 10 or 15 years before that in which the South had been forced to change, and they fought that change tooth and nail. So I grew up in a society in which racism was common, in which classism, as you can see reflected in The Unvanquished, was common. And one of the things I had hoped until recently, and I still hope it's actually true, and that we're just getting an exaggerated picture from media, one of the things that I had hoped was that I would be the last generation to grow up in that kind of South. My generation, the last generation, to live with those memories. That's clearly not going to be the case. I'd hoped that change would come faster, and it seems as though we've hit a point in where we just have to hope that we're not going backwards. And as a Southerner, this deeply affects me. A long time ago, I read a book called The Burden of Southern History. It's a collection of essays by the Southern historian C. Van Woodward, and there's some excellent stuff in here. And when I read this book, this is where it kind of clicked in my head that maybe I could be a member of that last generation of Southerners who remembered people who celebrated that legacy of hatred and racism and classism. And part of what made me hope that was this passage, which I'm going to read to you now. Van Woodward writes, "The time is coming, if indeed it has not already arrived, when the Southerner will begin to ask himself whether there is really any longer very much point in calling himself a Southerner, or if he does, he might well wonder occasionally whether it's worthwhile insisting on the point. So long as he remains at home where everyone knows him, the matter hardly becomes an issue. But when he ventures among strangers, particularly up north, how often does he yield to the impulse to suppress the identifying idiom, to avoid the awkward subject, and to blend inconspicuously into the national pattern, to act the role of a standard American? Has the Southern heritage become an old hunting jacket that one slips on comfortably while at home, but discards when he ventures abroad in favor of some more conventional or modish garb?" So when I read that, I thought about that metaphor of being Southern as something you put on when you're at home in the South, like an old hunting jacket that's really comfortable. Then you take off when you're in society of non-Southerners. I thought to myself, I don't even want to put the jacket on, and I'm hoping that my generation won't put on that jacket of that aspect of Southern history and heritage that is that uncomfortable topic that we as Southerners don't like to talk about, and it still seems to be that there's some work for us to do as Southerners. So the last thing I want to tell you is that despite my ancestry, and I did have ancestors on both sides of my family who fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War, that my parents taught me better, and I hope that I've taught my kids better. And I hope that we as Southerners can embrace the things that make us unique and wonderful and discard the heritage of the Confederacy, which is a heritage of hate, and that we should celebrate the multicultural nature of the South. We should celebrate the uniqueness of Southern expression and the Southern sense of humor, and get beyond flags and statues and monuments and move forward. If you have never read any William Faulkner, The Unvanquished is a good place to start. It's not stream of consciousness. It is a straightforward narrative. It's a good story. I hope what Faulkner intended was that change would come to the South, and I remain hopeful that change will come to the South and the United States of America in general. Anyway, let me know what you think about my rant and about my discussion of The Unvanquished in the comments section, and thank you for watching.